99.94. That number isn't just a statistic. It's the most famous batting average in cricket history. Think about it. Imagine dominating your sport so completely that teams had to invent entire strategies just to bring you down. That was Don Bradman. His batting made opponents desperate, and his records still feel untouchable today.
Enter Don Bradman, who got a great ovation.
But here's the catch. The most quoted moment of his career wasn't another towering score, but a single duck at the Oval in 1948. That one failure became the most famous punctuation in career of near unmatched dominance. So how does a boy from a small town rise to that point? Let's start at the very beginning. What set Bradman apart was that his foundations were laid not in grand stadiums, but in the backyard of Bowral, a small town in New South Wales. His training kit was simple: a golf ball, a broken stump, and the side of a water tank. Hour after hour, he would strike that ball and adjust to its erratic bounce. The drill was crude, but it sharpened his reactions, quickened his feet, and gave him an unbreakable eye for the ball. Soon, the discipline spilled into matches. At just 12 years old, he scored 115 not out for his school team, a glimpse of what was to come. Yet cricket at the top level was far more than just strokes. It tested character, nerve, and endurance. Bowlers probed weaknesses in both skill and temperament, and many seasoned batsmen eventually cracked. In that climate, the idea of a quiet boy from Bowral challenging hardened professionals seemed unlikely. But he made himself impossible to ignore. Runs kept piling up in local games until selectors had no choice but to pay attention. What struck people was not only the numbers, but how he had scored them. Where older batsmen blocked and bided time, he played differently. He attacked with footwork rather than waiting to defend, turning ordinary deliveries into scoring opportunities. It wasn't recklessness, it was control, honed from that backyard drill. His rise soon carried proof on a scale nobody could dismiss. Within a few years, he set a first-class record of 452 not out, the highest score of its time. And in the 1930 Ashes, he hammered 974 runs in a single series. Those figures stunned even seasoned selectors and made ordinary fans feel they were watching something entirely new. The leap from Bowral's backyard to the world stage was complete. That timing mattered. Australia was reeling from the Great Depression. Jobs vanished, families scrambled for basics, and optimism was thin. In that atmosphere, Bradman's feats weren't just statistics, they were relief. His batting gave people something else to talk about, something they could be proud to follow. Newspapers carried his scores on front pages. Workplaces paused when updates came over the radio. For hours at a time, he offered distraction and a sense that Australia could stand tall. Then came the innings that echoed across cricket history. 334 at Leeds during the 1930 Ashes. English crowds, used to home bowlers controlling visiting batsmen, stood in silence as he tore apart every plan. Each stroke reinforced the feeling that he wasn't simply competing, he was reshaping the game. For opponents, it bordered on humiliation. For Australians, it was a vindication that their champion was not just good, but commanding the world stage. Performance after performance added weight. Test matches that once felt balanced swung when Bradman arrived at the crease. Bowlers who had mastered others found themselves searching in vain for answers. He was no longer just a rising star, he was redefining what batting could look like, compressing decades of tradition into something sharper, faster, and beyond normal limits. And yet, history shows us that when one player dominates too heavily, the game itself pushes back. England, having borne the brunt of those vast scores, began searching for a countermeasure. Their pride demanded it, their public demanded it, and their bowlers badly needed it. The question now hung in the air. So how did England respond when a 22-year-old from Bowral seemed to be rewriting the sport? In the summer of 1932-33, England arrived with a plan unlike anything seen before. Captain Douglas Jardine, determined to contain Bradman, devised what would be called bodyline. To carry it out, he turned to the fierce pace of Harold Larwood, backed by Bill Voss. Their method was simple but unsettling. Short pitch balls aimed directly at the batsman's body, with a ring of leg side fielders set to snatch at any defense fend. They didn't try to outbat him, they aimed to intimidate him. And for the first time, Bradman's numbers showed it. Over the series, he still made 396 runs, averaging 56.57 solid, by any normal standard, yet far from the sky-high averages people had come to expect. It was a clear sign that the tactic had reduced his dominance, even if it could not silence him completely. For spectators, raised on the idea of a cricket as a game of skill and fairness, the visual of Larwood pounding and targeting the body again and again was stunning. The strategy defied the omens of bat and ball. Crowds gasped, newspapers filled with sharp words, and a sense of unease grew over whether sport had tipped into something cruel. The action was not limited to the ground. Debate spilled into presses, parliaments, and dinner tables. Ordinary fans were divided, some praising England for bravery, others seeing the plan as unsporting. Diplomatic unease even stirred between governments, as officials worried the series could chill relations between Australia and England. Bodyline was no longer just about a set of matches, it had become a test of values. For Bradman, the battle was as much mental as physical. A batsman who had once seemed all instinct and flow now faced spells of raw hostility. Rather than crumbling, he shifted his approach. He stepped across the crease to change angles. He played straighter when the leg side was clogged. He relied on footwork and agility rather than flamboyance. He never allowed himself to be simply pinned down. Yet, contemporaries observed that something did change Bodyline, plucked something vibrant from his art. His batting, though still effective, carried a more measured edge. That's what made this moment so striking. Until then, Bradman had looked almost technical in his mastery, as if unlimited runs were inevitable. Bodyline showed that he could be severely tested. Every inning became an act of persistence. For fans, the sight of Bradman ducking, weaving, and still finding runs cemented a deeper respect. He was not just a scoring machine, he was a figure of grit who could endure bombardment and still carry Australia's hopes. The paradox was inescapable. Jardine and his bowlers had set out to diminish him, but their tactic, by revealing his capacity to adapt, gave his legend greater weight. He emerged not only as the premier run scorer of his era, but as a symbol of resolve under the hardest pressures the game had seen. In the end, Bodyline could not break him. It forced a change, hardened his game, and left scars that shaped how people remember him. More than statistics, it was the trial that proved his resilience reached beyond talent into character. But as fierce as England's assault had been, his next challenges would come from elsewhere, not from bowlers across 22 yards, but from his own body, where illness and strain cast doubt over whether he could sustain greatness at all. Resilience and reinvention often define the middle chapter of careers, and for Bradman, this was his real test. After years of staggering dominance, he suddenly faced obstacles that had nothing to do with bowlers. His body began to betray him. Chronic fibrositis left him with persistent pain and stiffness, cutting into the very mobility that had made his batting so sharp. Not long after, he suffered acute appendicitis, which developed into peritonitis, a condition usually fatal at the time. The surgery was so serious that obituaries were drafted while he hovered near death. These blows rattled public confidence. For a batsman whose mastery relied on timing, reflex, and endurance, losing those physical guarantees put everything in doubt. Supporters who had once expected him to score at will wondered whether he could even stay healthy enough to play. And in an era when his presence at the crease symbolized hope for a struggling nation, every absence from the team's list carried more than sporting weight. It felt like a collective setback. What made this period even more testing was a shift in Bradman's personal life. He had married Jessie Menzies in 1932 and by 1934 moved to Adelaide to begin work as a stockbroker. That wasn't a side hobby, it was a deliberate attempt to anchor his future beyond the field. A move supported by officials hoping he would also lead South Australian cricket. The combination of work, family, and administrative duties meant he was no longer living just an athlete. Balancing these responsibilities alongside illness threatened to slow even a figure as driven as he was. Yet, he found ways to respond. During the 1934 Ashes tour of England, still recovering from illness and visibly drained, Bradman reminded the cricketing world what he was capable of. At Headingley, he produced 304, and at the Oval, he followed with 244. These weren't routine knocks, they were monumental innings, carved out when many doubted his capacity to last long at the crease. They proved he could adapt and still dominate at the highest level, even while carrying recurring ailments. This was reinvention in action. Early on, his game had looked almost mechanical, runs flowingly as if untouched by effort. Now, survival required adjustments. He became more selective, relied on more precise stroke play, and paced his batting with greater care. Instead of overwhelming opponents with sheer volume, he learned to channel efficiency, showing that greatness could be reshaped to fit harsher realities. Fans felt this shift deeply. In the same way, his early exploits lifted spirits during the Depression. His return after brushes with Friendly reassured Australians that even their hero could bend without breaking. It wasn't just about milestones. Each recovery reminded people that resilience itself was part of his genius. Watching him emerge from hospital beds or long gaps in the team and then still command the crease told a story many needed to believe, that setbacks did not erase the capacity for triumph. Over the years, his middle phase became as meaningful as his record-smashing start. Fibrositis never left him, and the scars from his near-fatal illness lingered. But those realities reframed his greatness. He wasn't only the prodigy who once seemed untouchable, he was the champion who had been tested by life and still rose back. The balance of fragility and resolve became central to his legend. Greatness, in his case, meant not the absence of limits, but the mastery of adaptation. By the time he steadied himself again, Bradman had shown the cricketing world something beyond brilliant stroke play. He demonstrated that an athlete could withstand pain, responsibility, and public expectation and still invent new ways to succeed. To Australia, those years were proof that resilience and reinvention mattered just as much as raw talent. And while this phase fortified his legacy, the most unforgettable chapter of all was still waiting. Because the moment that would echo louder than any century didn't come from runs at all, it came from the silence of a failure that turned into lasting myth. By 1948, Bradman stood not just a champion, but as a captain of a team that history would call the Invincibles. That summer in England, his Australians swept through county matches and tests unbeaten. The war years were behind them, the crowds were hungry for sport, and this tour felt like more than cricket. It was renewal, pride, and spectacle rolled into one. Bradman himself made 11 centuries in first-class games on that trip, piling up 2,428 runs at an average close to 90. Even as his powers had started to wane, he was still untouchable at a level no one else could approach. By the time the final test at the Oval arrived, the sense of occasion was overwhelming. Everyone knew it was his last series. The last test came loaded with expectation. Australia had already secured the Ashes and the unbeaten tour record. Bradman walked to the crease with one more number hanging over him. His test average stood at 99.94. He needed just 4 runs to reach the mathematical perfection of finishing with a career average of exactly 100. A milestone no cricketer had touched and likely never would again. The tension was so sharp that even people who had never cared for averages grasped its meaning. The atmosphere that day was like nothing else in cricket. Crowds packed the Oval, radios buzzed across continents, and people pressed in knowing they might witness the crowning finish. A single boundary would bring the century average. It felt like history had already written the ending. All that remained was the applause. And then came the shock. Second ball, balled by Eric Hollies. A googly, Bradman misjudged. His stumps were hit. He was out for a duck. Just like that, the fairy tale closed with silence. Thousands at the Oval felt quiet. Some wept, others gasped. All knew they had seen the turning point. After 2 decades of dominance, the script had ended in irony, 4 runs short of statistical perfection. Stories later claimed Bradman had tears in his eyes and misread the ball. For the rest of his life, he denied that version. He insisted he was not overcome, only beaten by a good delivery. That detail matters. The dismissal was not staged, not softened. It was pure sport, and it cut through like very few moments ever have. Yet, strangely, the duck did not tarnish him. It lifted him. The failure humanized him, and in doing so transformed his legend into something larger. 99.94 was no disappointment. It became emblematic, A perfect 100 might have been admired and filed away, falling just short turned into poetry. It suggested that greatness to endure requires one flaw left open. Over the years, the number has grown into the most famous statistic in world sport. It is coded outside cricket, used as a shorthand for dominance, and yet unreachable perfection. Just imagine it. In other sports, the greatest names, whether Jordan, LeBron, Messi, Ronaldo, Federer, are still tethered to rivals and debate. Bradman sat apart, the gulf so wide it feels otherworldly. And 99.94 made it sharper still. It told a story that statistics alone could not, that even the best cannot control their farewell.